Anyone familiar with Alco's history could easily come to the conclusion that the company never made a mistake it didn't like and wouldn't ultimately make. The company's long history of blunders dated all the way back to the late 30s. While Alco had found at least moderate success with its diesel switcher locomotives, the company decided it wanted more, and thus came the development of its first diesel road locomotive, which we made with a modified Raymond Loewy design, and utilized some of the company's existing switcher prime movers to get things started quickly. This model would be known as the DL-109. With a rushed development time and major corners cut, this locomotive would set the pattern for Alco's major bungles going forward. The DL-109 quickly developed major reliability issues, and only managed to survive into the 1950s with very few exceptions. Part of the reason why it made it this long is that domestic diesel locomotive manufacturing had been strongly curtailed during World War II thanks to the War Production Board, which had taken control of all domestic production during World War II in the United States. And thus, with a limited supply of diesel engines available and a huge demand for them, these engines were simply kept around a little while longer. Alco would learn little of anything from the DL-109, as the company would commit the same mistakes rushing its 244 prime mover into production without proper quality testing and without checking for design flaws that would develop when the engine was in production and in fact installed in customers' locomotives, spelling disaster for Alco's reputation and costing the company millions upon millions of dollars. All of this is not to say that Alco was never capable and never did make any products that were worthwhile. The Alco RS-1, for example, was the world's first road switcher. This is to say it was capable of doing both road jobs, such as passenger trains, as well as freight trains on the main line, but could also work switching jobs in yards, as well as around tight clearance, branch lines, and even if necessary be used as a helper engine to help engines over steep grades. Another good example of a good product produced by Alco was the Alco 251 prime mover, which incidentally was the direct successor to the 244. We're in sharp contrast to the 244, which is known for cracked blocks, broken crankshafts, and blown turbochargers. The 251 would prove to be a very reliable, robust, and capable power plant to propel locomotives, as long as it didn't fall into one of the time periods where Alco was cutting corners to improve its profit margins, such as the infamous piston cap debacle, where the company utilized inferior alloys to manufacture its piston caps, improving its profit margin but reducing the reliability of the prime mover significantly, with failed piston caps becoming a new failure point of the 251, further tarnishing the company's already tattered reputation. It was infamous mistakes or bumbles like this that caused the company's sales of its individual locomotive products to fall to the hundreds, while its biggest competitor, GM, was selling in the thousands in terms of its locomotives. These seemingly never-ending screw-ups would eventually lead one-time partner GE, who supplied the electrical components such as the traction motors and generators for its locomotives, to part ways with Alco and go out on its own. This is not to say that GE wasn't capable of screwing up on its own. For example, the water-cooled turbochargers provided to Alco's locomotives, like the RD3 and 4 series turbos. While these did improve the reliability compared to Alco's current products at that time, they were still riddled with faults and would eventually be ousted by Alco with its own 510 and 710 turbos replacing them. Incidentally, the Alco 510 and 710 turbos proved much more reliable than anything GE built in terms of turbochargers. Without the deals on the electrical components it was buying for its locomotives, Alco's overhead jumped noticeably. Not to mention, it now gained another competitor, something it clearly didn't need. Now, what if I were to tell you that there was a time that Alco could have taken GE out as a competitor with one fell swoop that was literally handed to them on a silver platter, and Alco's response to this wonderful deal was to say no? This is the story of the pony truck affair. How Alco's refusal to place a locomotive on top of a specific type of wheel arrangement would eventually lead one of its competitors to get a notable foothold in the market and essentially finance Alco's own demise. Before we continue, I'd like to give a heartfelt thanks to my main source for this story, a Mr. Thomas Anderson, one of the last living, if not the last living, employees of Alco, who worked for Alco from 1952 to 1969. From 1969 onward, Mr. Anderson then worked with GE Transportation internationally again, which gives him the unique perspective of knowing both sides of the story firsthand. Thank you very much, Thomas, again for sharing your information with me. I really appreciate it, and for bringing this very much pivotal moment in Alco's history to my attention, as I admit I was not even aware of it until Thomas got in touch with me. The year was 1958, at which point in time Thomas was the service engineer for Alco in Mexico, and at which point GE, Alco's partner, who had by this point dissolved its partnership with Alco and decided to produce its own locomotives. And in addition to the switchers it initially started producing domestically, which I mentioned in my U-25 video, they were also producing locomotives specifically for export to foreign countries, such as Mexico. He noted, at the MDM, otherwise known as the National Railway of Mexico's shops in San Luis Potosí, which were quite massive, the presence of 10 GE UD-18Bs that were curiously hidden behind a row of trees. This was particularly perplexing as these locomotives were practically brand new, with this particular model of export locomotive being introduced in 1956, and the National Railroad of Mexico was always known for being somewhat power short, even in its best of situations. When he asked the shop staff as to what the heck these pretty much brand new locomotives were doing out of service, hidden behind a row of trees, he was informed that there was a delegation of managers coming down to visit the shop, and embarrassingly enough, the shop had not been able to figure out how to get these engines to run reliably. The infamous Cooper-Bessemer-based power plants that were utilized in these locomotives, again this is before GE introduced the FDL-16 power plants, were known for breaking down and failing chronically. These locomotives were the very definition of lemons. Heck, if GE was in the automobile manufacturing business, they could have easily called this thing the Vega. And the shop personnel did not want to admit to the delegation of managers that were arriving that they were unable to keep these nearly new GE locomotives functioning. Thomas was then asked to quote the company a price for replacing the Cooper-Bessemer prime movers with Alco 251 prime movers by the then San Luis Potosí shop manager Rafael Perez Palengo. Yes, the railroad was that desperate to get rid of these infamous power plants, and GE's reputation was that terrible at that time. Needless to say, if one owns a business and one's competitor is being contracted to fix one's business's own product, that's a pretty good indication that your product has some serious flaws. Not long after this discussion took place, Thomas left Mexico and Rafael was sadly killed in a car accident. The re-engineering plans came to nothing. About this same time at the Alco New York offices, a bid was being put together for the South African Railways, which had requested a special type of locomotive that could handle light rail, specifically that of the Southwest African Division, which, in addition to the already mentioned light tracks, were still using German-built steam locomotives to pull their trains, which were now approaching the end of their lives. At this present time in history, the retracking of the Southwest Division wasn't possible, let alone practical. And so, therefore, the diesel replacement for the steam locomotives would have to accommodate the light track conditions. To accomplish this, the trucks and/or bogies, as they're known in other countries, would have to possess far more wheels than usual to help spread the weight out on the light tracks and/or avoid damage to it as well as derailments. The extra wheels consisting of unpowered axles called idlers that were designed again to spread the weight out without putting stress on the tracks. Another option, of course, was to use pony wheels. This is a concept similar to what we see in a steam locomotive, where the locomotive has guide wheels underneath the cowcatcher to guide the locomotive into curves, then main drive wheels that actually propel the locomotive, and possibly an extra set underneath the cab to support the cab itself, thus spreading the locomotive's weight out. To this end, two-bit options were given to the specific specifications of the trucks and/or bogies on these locomotives. The first and most desirable specification for this particular locomotive setup, as made clear by an Alco representative who visited South Africa during the bidding phase of this particular locomotive design, and after several meetings with South African railway officials, would have been for 115 locomotives generating 1,800 horsepower each, incorporating a 1cc1 reel arrangement for the locomotive's trucks or bogies. This is to say the truck incorporates one idler or pony axle in front of 3 powered axles to help spread the weight more effectively. This is the option that again the South African railways made very clear was most desirable. An alternative option which the South African railways made available to bidders on this new class of locomotives was for 230 1,200 horsepower locomotives with CC-type wheel arrangements. This is to say each truck would be composed of 3 axles apiece, each powered, to spread the weight along the tracks. This again would be the less desirable option, as it would be less effective in terms of spreading the weight of the locomotive out on the light track. Although less effective, the 6-axle option was definitely the more conventional option. This would, for very bizarre reasons, come into play here. And so, with the South African Railways' preference for the pony trucks in mind, Alco began to put together a bid for 115 1,800 horsepower locomotives equipped with these requested trucks. Things were really beginning to look up at Alco at this point. While the 244 was a disaster, the new 251 was proving very reliable and capable, and the company still maintained a lot of inroads, not to mention popularity as well as a good reputation, with its export locomotive business, such as the one it was now signing a contract for, or at least looked to have one in the bag for, in terms of the South African Railways and the pony truck bid. Unfortunately, Alco was Alco, and needless to say, they were about to make a big blunder. Alco was at the time headed by the short-fused and somewhat eccentric Perry Egbert, who, once he heard of the pony truck quote being put in for the South African locomotives, flew into a rage, apparently finding fault with the unusual pony trucks being utilized for these locomotives. He announced quite loudly at the 530 Fifth Avenue location of Alco's New York offices that the company would not be building any more effing steam engines, and would only allow the 230cc truck locomotive option to be quoted. Luckily for the South African Railways, at least, they were smart enough to not put all their eggs in one basket in terms of finding a company that was going to produce their new locomotive. One would have thought that GM, who was dominating the domestic U.S. manufacturing of locomotives at the time, as well as export locomotives to a certain extent, would have been the prevalent option to go as an alternative to Alco. Unfortunately for GM's EMD division, this was not the case. The South African Railways found fault with the somewhat primitive two-cycle combustion engines that GM used in its locomotive models, finding them both crude and lacking fuel efficiency. This left them but one alternative to Alco, and that was General Electric. And while GE was definitely not the company's first choice, the South African Railways would end up submitting a quote request to the company to give them a backup in case something went wrong with the Alco deal, which of course happened. Meanwhile, at Erie, Pennsylvania, where GE's main locomotive manufacturing facility was located, things weren't exactly looking all that great, to put it mildly. Its Cooper-Bessemer-based export locomotives weren't exactly setting the world on fire, with chronic reliability issues and quality control problems being found. And while the company had seen at least some success with its small industrial switcher lines, these locomotives were far less profitable than the mainline locomotives the company was aspiring to make. And, much like its export locomotives, GE was finding great difficulty in maintaining a supply of reliable prime movers to put in these locomotives to keep production rolling, as at that time, GE did not produce its own prime mover and was simply using the likes of Cooper-Bessemer and a few other manufacturers such as Cummins to produce prime movers for their engines as subcontractors. Even the company's internal attempt to rectify the issue with the Cooper-Bessemer power plants, which would eventually be known as the FDL-16, was rife with problems. One most notable issue was an issue on the FDL-16 where the join between the head and the block was not sealing correctly, and thus causing a massive leak. Mind you, this was a metal-on-metal seal with no gasket being employed currently. In the end, GE, after spending tens of millions of dollars in, mind you, 1950s cash in trying to correct this problem, will end up sending this prime mover out to a Swiss company and basically told them to cure it. The cure for this issue and other such problems that kept propping up would mean this prime mover would not be ready anytime soon for production. Things had gotten so desperate at GE's locomotive division that the company's division had even entered into preliminary talks with Alco to utilize the 251 prime mover in GE's own locomotives. Essentially, the conclusion was eventually reached not long after these talks had begun that it made no sense to have two companies building what essentially would wind up being the same locomotive. Although one does get the sense that at least one factor was the idea of GE being Goliath having to bend down and kiss David's feet and essentially beg Alco for help after spending a few years now trying to pound the company, which was its former partner in the locomotive production segment of the market, into the ground. Would have not appealed to the higher-ups at GE as well as GE shareholders. It was around this time that GE had received the same in tandem request from the South African Railways for the pony truck and non-pony truck locomotive designs as mentioned before. It was pretty clear by this point, and again this is before Egbert had intervened, that Alco had this contract in the bag. GE knew, especially with all the issues it was having with its current prime movers being supplied by Cooper-Bessemer, it could not match Alco for quotes, as it would have to at least in some way help finance Cooper-Bessemer's redesign of its existing power plant to build something worthy of handling this locomotive, or find an alternative manufacturer for this prime mover, or perhaps in some way speed up the development of its own FDL-16 prime mover, and in turn, in order to attain anything resembling profitability with this locomotive, the company would need to pad its quote sufficiently, giving it a disadvantage in this process. And so it gave a quick proposal that was thrown together seemingly overnight with a very much higher quote that didn't seem to have any hope in gaining traction. Then, after Egbert's refusal to build the effing steam locomotives, as he referred to the pony truck-equipped locomotives that the South African Railway was requesting of Alco, GE was shocked when the South African Railways contacted them and informed them that they had actually won the contract. This came as an extreme shock to GE, not understanding how Alco could have made such an idiotic decision, which now opened the door to GE to keep its own locomotive production division in business. With the failure of the Alco 251 talks, GE had already made the decision to roll up its mainline locomotive production division. In fact, its locomotive assembly building, known as Building 10, at its Erie plant, was already in the process of being renovated for use by the company's motor division. Even with the newly acquired contract to build 115 pony trucked engines for the South African Railways, there was still much internal resistance at GE to keeping the locomotive division up and running, as the company had failed so badly in its past years with it. After much internal debate, GE decided to go ahead with the production of these 115 locomotives. What one would have thought was the most notable issue about this particular locomotive, especially considering Alco's idiotic move to not produce the locomotive itself, specifically the pony-type trucks with their unusual wheel arrangement, really wasn't an issue at all. The General Steel Castings Corporation had already been contracted by Alco to design the pony trucks for their particular locomotive, and essentially had a design all ready to go. All GE essentially had to do was say, yeah, we'll take that. And this is essentially what happened. What's highly ironic about this is that this was Alco's main stumbling block with building this locomotive, and it was all set to be produced for the company. All Alco would have been responsible for is installing these specific trucks on those locomotives. What was a notable stumbling block / issue for GE was the prime mover itself. While the company's internal project to produce its own prime mover, called the FDL-16, had somehow avoided cancellation despite the initial roll-up of the company's locomotive production division, it was still far, far away from anything resembling production, as it still had the massive leak which the Swiss company which GE contracted had not solved as of yet. This left GE with few options, as the Alco 251 negotiations had already been broken off, and there was no way the company was going to go crawling back to Alco, especially now. This left GE with only one place left to turn, and that was Cooper Bessemer. And yes, that was the same company which produced the rather infamous prime mover for GE's not-so-successful UD-18B. In fact, it would be the very same prime mover that propelled that locomotive, known as the FVBL-12T, that would power the new locomotive, which would now be known as the Class 32,000. Now, I've never been able to find out quite what happened here, but apparently Cooper Bessemer was written hard by GE to fix the problems with the prime mover before it was put out, and/or the technicians were simply that much better trained. Whatever the case, the prime mover would be much more successful in the South African Class 32,000 than it was in the UD-18B. These units would be in service from the early 1960s all the way until the 1990s, with various different companies, including the South African Railways. While this class of locomotive had a long life, only 5 locomotives survive in preservation. While it has been said and proven that all human beings make mistakes, this was the mistake of the century for Alco, as while failing to get a lucrative contract for a locomotive based upon a wheel arrangement that was placed underneath it, which would have been inconsequential to the company, it also managed to at the same time give a foothold to a dying competitor that could have easily been taken out with one swoop. This competitor, of course, being GE, who would eventually take Alco out altogether and eventually even dominate GM for U.S. domestic locomotive production. It accomplished this mainly through the South African Railways deal, as in addition to the lucrative contract to produce these locomotives, more than 60% of all South African Railways locomotives now came from GE, because of the relationship it struck up with the company. With the success of the South African Railways contract for these particular locomotives, GE felt ready, not to mention confident enough, to enter the domestic road locomotive market with its U-25B. In 1959, after the completion of development on the FDL-16 prime mover, which would power it, and a whole series of locomotives called the Universal Series that would follow. And while the Universal Series wasn't necessarily the greatest thing since sliced bread, at least in terms of its reliability, it certainly gave the company, much like the South African contract, a foothold. And the rest, to quote my source Thomas Anderson, was history. And that's going to do it for this particular video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe as it will help me greatly. And as always, keep the metal side down.